The NHS, or the National Health Service, is the largest employer in Europe. It is also one of the largest employers all over the world. Only a few organizations employ more people than the National Health Service. These organizations are the Ministry of Defense of India, the Department of Defense of the United States of America, the People's Liberation Army of China, Walmart, and Amazon. The National Health Service, or NHS, was established in the United Kingdom on 5th July 1948, and it refers to the public health services that are provided in the United Kingdom. Britain was the first Western country to offer free, at the point of use medical care to the whole population. In this video, we will talk about the history of the NHS as described on the official UK government website. How did the NHS come to be? Let us have a look back at the creation of the National Health Service and how the government of the day, led by Prime Minister Clement Attlee, set about introducing this transformative reform. The Second World War led to an immense loss of life and induced considerable hardships. Britons endured rationing, which continued even after the war was over. Evacuation, destruction, or damage to millions of homes and workplaces, air raids, as well as the mass pivoting of the nation's people and resources to meet the vast war effort had taken place. The period between the First World War and the Second World War had also left its mark. The interwar years were a time of economic depression and social deprivation. There had been no great development of state provision. Attlee and his cabinet had lived through and in many cases fought in both wars and recognized the need for reconstruction and expansion. A comprehensive welfare system was at the heart of this. During the Second World War, the coalition government, led by Conservative Prime Minister Winston Churchill and leader of the Labour Party Clement Attlee, Deputy Prime Minister from 1942, seized on the need for post-war reconstruction. Despite the preoccupation with fighting a world war, the government prioritized planning for this. In June 1941, Labour Minister Arthur Greenwood announced to the House of Commons that a new committee had been formed to survey existing social security provision and allied services under the chairmanship of Sir William Beveridge. This became the Totemic 1942 Beveridge Report, which identified 5 giants that needed to be tackled in order for Britain to succeed economically and socially. The 5 giants were want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. Influential economist and civil servant John Maynard Keynes was also consulted by Beveridge during the making of the report. At his suggestion, Beveridge modified some recommendations, thus Keynes believed the plan to be broadly affordable. The report was published on 2nd December 1942 and immediately became a bestseller at home and abroad. It cost 2 shillings. Some 256,000 copies of the full report, 369,000 copies of an abridged version, and 40,000 copies of an American edition were sold in 12 months. The proposals received widespread support across the political spectrum. The recommendations of the Beveridge Report widened the scope set by Lloyd George's National Insurance Act 1911. Beveridge offered a blueprint for a comprehensive welfare state. In the years after publication, the coalition government worked on plans for turning the recommendations into reality, including producing a white paper. Full implementation was, however, not guaranteed. In March 1943, Churchill warned against imposing significant new expenditures without knowing the full post-war economic picture. Yet he also advocated a national compulsory insurance for all classes for all purposes from the cradle to the grave. On 5th July 1945, the Labour Party led by Clement Attlee won a landslide victory at the polls with a majority of 146 seats. After winning the general election, the Attlee government set about creating a comprehensive welfare state, at the heart of which was the NHS. Indeed, Labour had entered the election offering the full Beveridge. Attlee's executive efficiency would be integral to introducing and implementing such a huge program. Though Britain and its allies had emerged victorious, the strain of total war had left the country in a desperate state. Yet Attlee reflected, "We had not been elected to try to patch up an old system but to make something new. I therefore determined that we would go ahead as fast as possible with our program." Attlee's social and political work in the East End of London shaped his view of the role of the state. By the time he was in government, ideas that had seemed very much his own were now part of an emerging consensus. Attlee wrote, "I have witnessed now the acceptance by all leading politicians in this country and all the economists of any account of the conception of the utilization of abundance. In 1918, as a soldier in the First World War, Attlee expounded his sense of purpose. We live in a state of society where the vast majority live stunted lives. We endeavor to give them a freer life." On arrival in Downing Street, Attlee faced a challenging economic picture. A month into office, it got gloomier with the abrupt end of the US Lend-Lease scheme. Subsequently, the US made a further loan agreement with Britain. However, Hugh Dalton, Attlee's Chancellor of the Exchequer, noted that the situation remained desperately difficult. US Marshall aid from 1948 until 1951 would also provide critical support for the British economy. Attlee, in assembling his cabinet, appointed the political firebrand, South Wales miner and trade unionist Aneurin Bevan as Minister of Health. The King's Speech on 15 August 1945 outlined an ambitious legislative program including nationalization of the fuel and power industries, civil aviation, Bank of England, as well as establishing a National Health Service. Chancellor Hugh Dalton worked closely with Bevan to establish the financial foundation for the introduction of the NHS. Dalton found Bevan's vitality and drive impressive, and Bevan's biographer credits Dalton as, after Bevan, the chief architect of the NHS. During the Second World War, the scope of health insurance had been extended, but it covered just half of the population and did not include hospital and specialist services, dental, optical, or hearing services. Universal provision, regardless of ability to pay, was at the core of the Attlee government's new reforms. Minister of Health Bevan set about building on the Beveridge Report and the coalition government's white paper. In October 1945, Bevan outlined his vision for a national health service. In December, he explained to cabinet that this was an opportunity which may not recur for years for a thorough overhaul and reconstruction of the country's health position. Prime Minister Attlee drew on a cricket metaphor to express his approval. Bevan had done well on a pretty sticky wicket. Provisions would include hospital care, ambulance services, GP services, maternity care, prescriptions, as well as optical care and dentistry. Turning the NHS from principle to policy required significant structural change and thus extensive negotiations with the medical profession, local authorities, committees, parliament, and with other cabinet ministers. It was an arduous process to say the least. What's more, the NHS was one of a series of reforms which formed the welfare state. How the state would pay for these reforms was a huge matter for the government of the day. Keynes had told the War Cabinet in May 1945 that Britain faced a financial Dunkirk. The 1946 National Insurance Act extended the contributions of working age people, except married women, in order to contribute to funding the provisions of the welfare state. Given its foundational status for the whole welfare program, Attlee focused his attention on ensuring the passage of the National Insurance Bill. In the House of Commons during the first and second readings, Attlee reflected on the historical battle for social reform and credited earlier pioneers. The Prime Minister also acknowledged the significant financial cost. The question is asked, can we afford it? Supposing the answer is no, what does that mean? It really means that the sum total of the goods produced and the services rendered by the people of this country is not sufficient to provide for all our people at all times, in sickness, in health, in youth, and in age. I cannot believe that we can submit to the world that the masses of our people must be condemned to penury. The National Health Service Act received royal assent on 6 November 1946. This, however, marked the beginning of a deeper, more protracted phase of negotiations in the run up to so called appointed day on 5th July 1948, when NHS provision would begin. As such, 1,143 voluntary hospitals and 1,545 municipal hospitals were taken over by the NHS in England and Wales. Historian Pauline Gregg recounted how nail biting the close it got. 6 months before the appointed day, it looked as though the whole edifice might crash through lack of support from the medical profession, but a near last minute agreement saved the structure. Up to this point, the medical profession exercised a significant degree of autonomy, and so the creation of a national health service would lead to some loss of freedom as well as increased bureaucratic demands. Bevan recognized this and stated, "Any health service which hopes to win the consent of the doctors must allay these fears. There is no alternative to self government by the medical profession in all matters affecting the content of its academic life. It is for the community to provide the apparatus of medicine for the doctor. It is for him to use it freely in accordance with the standards of his profession." The Minister of Health, however, was also determined to deliver his mission. No society can legitimately call itself civilized if a sick person is denied medical aid because of lack of means. Bevan secured the support of Cabinet to table a debate in the Commons on 9 February 1948, which confirmed the government's determination to begin NHS provision on appointed day. In the February debate, Bevan detailed the wholesale resistance to the implementation of the NHS Act from the professional bodies. Over the preceding months, Bevan made concessions and gave assurances to the medical profession on clinical freedom. By appointed day, a majority of GPs had applied to enter the NHS and 3/4 of the population had registered with the NHS. As the river of NHS provision began to flow, Bevan turned to his parliamentary private secretary Barbara Castle and said, "Barbara, if you want to know what all this is for, look in the perambulators." I hope you enjoyed this history of how the NHS came into being, and if you are someone who is trying to prepare for NHS interviews, then you would be well advised to know a thing or two about the NHS.